Good evening. Thanks for joining us live online for What the For, a kind of streaming news after party for people who can't get enough discussion and debate on world events. Tonight, we discuss the chaos in Ukraine. Who's right, who's not, and what happens next in a world where America, famous for drawing red lines, has run out of them. If you have a question or a point to make, tweet it using the hashtag WT4. I'll try and put your points to the panel, which are Alexander Nekrassov, the former Kremlin advisor, Kate Maltby of the think tank Bright Blue, and Marta Mulyak, a Ukrainian who's part of the Euromaidan protest movement here in London. But first, if the statues of Lenin are still falling, his famous saying holds true: a week is a long time in politics. It's just a week since men in unmarked uniforms began to seize installations in Crimea. Since then, we've seen many of the certainties of the world diplomatic order shredded. And its media order. One Russian TV presenter surprised her bosses with this:
"What Russia did is wrong."
Russian troops now control Crimea, and the Crimean parliament is preparing a referendum to leave Ukraine. In Donetsk, a majority Russian-speaking city in the east of Ukraine, the government buildings are controlled by rebels. Meanwhile, the West stands powerless. America has threatened trade sanctions and cut off military cooperation with Russia. John Kerry went to Kiev to express support for Ukraine's new government.
It is not appropriate to invade a country.
Britain's Sun newspaper summed up the problem: the EU is divided, maybe fatally, and it seems will do nothing in response.
We absolutely need to see a de-escalation of the situation.
As for Britain, a top civil servant revealed this document to waiting snappers, saying no sanctions, no asset seizures, and not even a whiff of military contingency planning. In a few short days, the political geography of Europe has altered, and the diplomatic balance in the world has changed. Well, this programme is all about you and your views, and this is how you tweet us with the hashtag WT4. Now, I'm going to have a look at some of the tweets that have been coming in. We've had already from somebody called Cygnus2020, how can Ukraine's illegitimate government now hope to claim the illegitimacy of Crimea's democratic vote to join Russia? I think they're basically saying, who's legitimate? Steve Jones, Russia won't back down as it'll be seen as a weakness by the West and vice versa. Goodwill, common sense, and a prayer needed. I think a lot of people saying that on the social media this week. And down the bottom there, Cygnus2020, I've lost it. It's moved, as these things can do on Twitter. It was a point, I think, about the legitimacy of the Ukraine government. But keep your tweets coming if you can. WT4 is the hashtag. To the panel, I think one of the things we see so much on the social media in response to this, ordinary people reacting to the crisis, is their first instinct is to look for principles. And Alexander Nekrassov, I want to put this to you. Isn't it true, in principle, that Russia has now violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine?
Well, it depends from which side you look at it, because on the one side, we have a puppet regime in Kyiv, which is totally under the
Puppet of?
The West. And of course, we have all the information, how it was funded, and we had all those politicians coming over. The problem with this regime is that they made a crucial mistake of sounding hostile to Russian speakers in Ukraine, to the eastern parts of the country, and then they backtracked immediately when they realized it was a massive mistake. Of course, they are seen by many people in Ukraine, especially in the east, and by some Russians who have friends or relatives, is that they are basically pro-EU in the sense that they're prepared to sell their country to the European Union, because the deal on the table, and I've read it, and I'm a former also advisor to the finance minister, I can tell it was a bad deal, very bad
Let's
deal.
come to that in a minute, but let me just take you back. We'll come to the other participants in a minute. Let me just take you back, Mr. Nekrassov, to the principle I put to you. Whatever the problem of the Kiev government, whatever the way we got here, the issue is has Russia violated the territorial rights of Ukraine as a country? Do we think yes or no?
No.
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 Why?
No, because there was a risk of civil war breaking out in the Crimea, and it's still a risk of civil war breaking out, and the only presence of Russian troops have stopped the bloodshed.
So, but
this is the most stable part of Ukraine.
When you see them stopping the OSCE monitors, this is the international monitors who've gone in, stopping them by force, that is not...
Well, not by force, they just stopped.
Well, I think if they had carried on, some force would have been applied.
Well, these observers represent a union which is responsible for the mess in Ukraine. They should not be there at all. We do not trust them. Before
we come to the others, let me just go back to some new tweets. Sam Wyde, is there any evidence that the American agents were involved in provocation in the Ukraine? Let me come to one or two of the others. We'll come back to you, Mr. Nekrassov. Marta Mulyak, you haven't been there. You're presumably in contact with friends and relatives there. What are they saying about this issue? It's all American agents.
Well, it's absolute nonsense. I don't think there are any American agents in Ukraine. I think Ukrainians went to protest in November because they did not like the only regime in Ukraine, which was regime of Mr. Yanukovych. And I really sincerely hope that, Alexander, you would agree with me that this was the only regime that we had in Ukraine, for many years. President. I'm really sorry, but let me just finish my point.
Let you have your point.
So I think there are absolutely no American...
I think the American Secret Service would be doing itself a disfavor if it had nobody there. But what you were saying is that there are no agents in the government. Let me just come to this tweet here. Petr Cortez 111. What are the legal consequences in terms of commitments of the USA and GB arising from the Budapest Memorandum? The Budapest Memorandum is, of course, the 1994 document that said, well, both Russia and the West respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. In return, Ukraine gives its nuclear weapons back. Kate Maltby, I mean, what do you reckon? What are technically, in principle, the West's commitment to Ukraine?
Well, one of the problems with the Budapest Memorandum is there are no terms of enforcement. I mean, this is a commitment that was signed without a break clause. What I think is most concerning and something that should worry all of us is what Putin said in his press conference on Tuesday morning about the Budapest 1994 agreement. He sat down and told the world that as far as he was concerned, the Ukraine, as it stands today, is a completely different country from the Ukraine that existed in 1994. And therefore, and I quote, "This is a new country with whom we have signed no binding commitments." This is the type of legal wriggling, frankly, the same sort of legal wriggling that Alexander has already been engaging in, that Putin is going to be developing as he argues with the West over these points of diplomacy.
Alexander Nekrassov, former Kremlin advisor, Russian investigative journalist and satirist. Nobody's laughing at this, are they? This is just what Putin did, what Kate described.
Well,
there.
excuse me, but it is brainwashing. These are young people who watch television. I have in front of me at home both Russian television, Ukrainian television. I can see and compare. The propaganda war is going on big time on Western television.
I think we can all accept that. We've all watched Western TV and Russian TV.
No, let me give you an example. Catherine Ashton's conversation with the Estonian foreign minister, which has been, by the way, confirmed by the Estonian foreign ministry. This is a serious reason to investigate.
Okay, I think for our viewers, this is a taped conversation which has been seen as genuine, and it is the conversation between the Estonian Prime Minister and Catherine Ashton, where they're saying maybe there were some snipers.
Not maybe.
Well,
not
he
maybe.
says maybe.
Sorry.
Actually.
No.
Says maybe.
He says maybe, and let's put it aside because he also rejects that. But let's again go to our tweets. Keith Cowan says, what red line do you think the UK and EU would be serious about if crossed by Russia? And let me, before I come to you, Kate Maltby, who's been writing about this, I think in the Telegraph as well as for your think tank. Marta, for Ukrainians, part of the Euromaidan movement, for you, what do you want the UK and the European Union we're a part of to do?
Well, I think Kremlin, Putin and Russian state are clearly showing their little tantrum around Ukraine. You know, they sort of got a bit scared that all of a sudden people of Ukraine are getting what they've wanted for a very, very long time. And again, Alexander just said a minute ago about brainwashing. So, and I have to say that I do speak a couple of languages and do read a lot of news, and I speak Russian and Ukrainian and English and German and understand Greek and Italian, and I do follow all of the news, and I have to tell you that there is no brainwashing, and the only brainwashing that is coming out is from Russia actually itself. Now, what I would like UK and US to do is to actually impose very serious political and economical sanctions on Russia, because I don't think that Mr. Putin realizes how you know, what a dangerous situation we are in. And I also think that the heart of Europe and heart of Ukraine is now, heart of the world is now in Ukraine. And we need to be carefully listening to that heart.
Mr. Nekrassov, you know, if the West did get its act together and put some serious sanctions on Russia,
no chance.
You may think there's no chance, but you better hope they don't, because the single product economy, oil and gas, and a large export of nefarious money would not survive it, would it?
It will flow to China.
It'll flow to China.
So
you're cool about
that. The West is in serious trouble. And as I said to you, I was a former advisor to the finance minister. And the debt of the Western countries is enormous. Their economies will collapse. Germany will never do this. Britain will never do this. France is already backtracking. Spain has already assured Russia no chance. So I don't really see how it can work, the sanctions.
Kate, I'll come to you in a minute. Ian Moody, what are the implications for political social stability in other former Eastern Bloc democracies? I mean, I'm presuming that Poles and Romanians and Estonians watching the Brits say not in a million years will we even plan military response to this. Doesn't go down particularly well geopolitically, Kate Maltby.
No, and if you read Russian media, and I think we all do in this room, if you look at what Putin's favorite historians, favorite journalists are all saying, they're all talking about the historic ties of Russia to the Baltic states. I mean, Russian textbooks, Russian schools are teaching the importance of the Russian Empire.
There are, of course, large minority populations in both Estonia and Latvia, Russian populations. So it's not just ideology.
No, it's not just ideology, and all three of the Baltic states have recently enacted very tight laws about cracking down on dual citizenship, just as the Ukraine has over the past recent years, because they're worried about people who have Russian passports, and they're trying to take those passports away from them.
I mean, Kate Maltby, Alexander Nekrassov just said there's no chance of Western sanctions, really, or European sanctions. You as an observer of the British foreign diplomatic elite, you know, do you get the impression that they would, you know, if they saw Russian tanks coming up Pall Mall, they might break into a sweat? I mean, are we just basically, are we in a 1930s situation where the Foreign Office is basically giving up on any kind of muscle flexing?
Well, it's true that Iraq has left a deep scar on the British political psyche. I would say, though, that the vote on Syria upset a lot of people in the Tory party. Michael Gove was personally very upset and very angry. A lot of people in the Foreign Office were very upset and very angry. So I think there is a move amongst some factions of the Tory party to try to make up for that by being tough on Russia.
Right. Tweets, Steve Cook. Why were there no votes against the referendum in the Crimea Parliament when 40% of its population are not Russian? Fear, question mark, and Vic London, does Russia hold too many cards for the West? So let's just segment that, let's just chunk it up a minute. Okay, so just to recap the situation, we've got I think it's next week we're due to have the referendum. We see what the question is in Crimea. It's a kind of, do you want to join Russia or do you want to go back to another form of joining Russia? Right, you know, what right do they have to hold this? There are kind of unidentified guys in balaclavas stalking the streets. Journalists being beaten up, we see. What kind of referendum would that be, Alexander Nekrassov?
Well, first of all, they never had a referendum in Crimea. They were just given by Khrushchev, a thug and a killer, to Ukraine because he covered up himself, because he committed horrible atrocities. And then when it fell apart, the Soviet Union, there was no referendum again. It was just decided it stays there. So they have to have. Kosovo, remember, why should it have had independence? It was part of Serbia for centuries. Well, they decided because there are more people there who don't want it. It's the same situation. Gibraltar, they could have. Scotland, it can have a referendum. So why not? The timing is not good. And I can tell you even more. Moscow is not happy with the timing. You know, this,
they're not happy.
They're not happy with the timing.
Putin could, I think,
it has to come down.
I think we can all accept that Vladimir Putin could pick up a phone to the relevant authorities.
No, he can't. He can't because it's out of control.
It is out of control.
It's out of control because of what this Kyiv is doing, you see? Because Kyiv had to also become calm. The West, this propaganda, this hysteria in the media, I'm absolutely astonished. I know these people, those journalists in Crimea. I can't understand what
we are not there and we're not on the ground. Marta Mulyak, will the Ukrainian people, will the people who sat on Euromaidan for all those weeks would they accept if it could be shown a referendum was carried out lawfully and without duress and without pressure? Do you think there are people in Ukraine who would accept a Crimean vote for independence?
Well, I don't think that people of Ukraine will accept that to begin with.
Why not?
First of all, because it is illegal and anti-constitutional. Crimea is part of Ukraine. It is a Ukrainian territory, and we can go back into the history as far as we want, but no, Crimea will stay with Ukraine.
Clear, and that kind of sets up the next tweet, which we've got Mike Hoffman, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I hope. Could we resolve the crisis with a unification fight between Klitschko and Putin? It's not wrong, is it, for people to start saying this when they see so many world statesmen, so-called, with their shirts off? I mean, Kate Maltby, that's not far from what's happening, is it?
It's not far from what's happening, but I'd still put my money on Putin. Bear in mind that Putin is an expert in martial arts, the type of martial arts that teach you to use an opponent's strength against them. Klitschko is, I'm afraid, a big guy. I think Putin could probably flip him over his shoulder in a surprise.
And what is one of our other ones? Are all the Ukrainian MPs who appointed the new PM properly elected and therefore legitimate? Do we know that, Marta?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. When Alexander previously was talking about illegitimate government and, all of these people sort of coming up and no one knows where they've come from. Well, all of the parliamentarians were elected in Ukraine, and people of Ukraine, and by the way, people of Crimea also elected them. So 371 parliamentarians voted for Mr. Yatsenyuk to become a prime minister, and so therefore this government is absolutely legitimate. And they're carrying out a very difficult mission at the moment.
No, Kate, yes.
May I come in on that? I think I am going to have to disagree with Marta here, despite the fact that I have been very critical of Putin's behavior in the region. I think it is dangerous for Western observers to buy in too much into the dream of the ideal of Ukrainian democracy as it stands now. I was speaking to a very senior EU negotiator earlier this week who was saying that the real problem for the EU is that the Ukraine is still one of the most corrupt places in the world. For the EU to trade openly with Ukraine, to welcome Ukraine into the economic embrace, it's going to have to seriously up its game.
Marta, I mean, a lot of British ordinary people, members of the public see that. They see this alternation between two sets of people, yes. One pro-Russian, one pro-Western, neither of whose public morals look particularly attractive. How do you break that cycle?
Well, we've got to start today, and I think we've started doing it in Ukraine. As I said before, this now is a legitimate government of Ukraine. I mean, they've got, as I said as well, they've got a very difficult role to play, a historical role to play. They will be re-elected, so it's not like they're coming for next 4 years. There will be a parliamentary elections, I'm sure of it. So Ukraine will have a very different set of people and politicians. But we need to start somewhere, and we start today.
No, our Twitter wall has posed us a question which I think has been perplexing all analysts and people watching the situation. The EU, Jude Pigeon says, EU should be far more worried about the extreme right in the Ukraine, who are now part of the government, than of the actions of Russia. Can we get to the facts? What do we know about the participation of far-right and fascist parties in the current government? Leave aside what they're doing on the street. Marta, let's start with you. What do you think, what do we know about the participation of people who are self-identified anti-Semitic fascists?
Well, I don't think, even though that there are maybe some people who are a little bit extreme on a spectrum, but there are no fascists in Ukraine. And I think the very good argument or fact for this will be that all Jewish communities of Ukraine came together, and they also come together with the Jewish community of the world, and they have sent an open letter to Mr. Putin. So I can assure you, if they would fear any fascist in Ukraine, they wouldn't have sent this letter today.
Mr. Nekrassov, what do you think about that? You were laughing, when you were saying that.
Well, I'm just, you have to know facts. 4 members of the party Freedom, who have close connections to these nationalists and the neo-Nazis, are members of the cabinet. I've looked at the list of new governors and new ministers. They're all multimillionaires, billionaires.
Perish the thought that any Russian politicians...
No. But I'm saying that they came on the ticket that we are new, we are progressive, we are not like the old lot. These are all children of the Orange Revolution, which collapsed after the first term. And it's laughable to see these people come in and pretend to be new blood.
Look, there are clearly far-right elements, and they were involved. Another one of our tweets from a Latvian, Thea Bogush. Nobody's safe with Putin playing Hitler. My Latvian relatives don't feel safe. The West won't do a thing. Kate Maltby, the parallels with the 1930s keep being thrown around. Are there any valid ones?
Yes. I think that it's quite clear that Putin is doing the same thing that Hitler did with the Sudetenland. He's announcing that there are plenty of people who are his fellow countrymen in another nation, another sovereign nation, and using that as an excuse to annex. This
was a German-speaking part of what was then Czechoslovakia in the interwar period. And Hitler encouraged the referendum there and then took it.
Yes, and what he then did was he went further in. Yeah. He went further in, and I think Putin quite clearly has his sights further west in Europe. What I would also say, though, is, first of all, comparisons with Hitler can often go too far, but Putin himself is absolutely no angel when it comes to anti-Semitism. There's been this great competition between the Putinistas and the Ukrainian nationalists to each paint the other side as more anti-Semitic. I actually think both are at fault on this particular one.
Alexander Nekrassov, what do you say to that?
Well, it's rubbish. I'm sorry. First of all, some of the richest, very many richest people in Russia are Jewish. I would say a lot of them. So to say that Russia
and yet
is
the only oligarchs
anti-Semitic
Putin actually goes after
is absolutely
are the Jewish
ridiculous.
Ones.
Any comparison between Hitler or something. Russia has lost 32 million. We saved Europe from Nazis. You would all be talking German nowadays. So to
and do you not worry, Mr. Nekrassov, that the moral capital that Russia accumulated during World War II, which is still prevalent along many of the older generation in Europe, is now being thrown away by this guy who struts around bare-chested, throwing away
Tony Black
capital.
called himself 5 times a night Tony officially.
We on this program know a lot about Tony Blair, but we're talking here about a man who is currently
This has no connection to what somebody did or how it was photographed. What we are seeing here, it was a coup against a legally elected president who was accepted by the European Union and became illegal the moment he didn't sign a very bad deal which would have destroyed Ukraine. I saw that deal, and I actually started to consult his government, say, don't ever come close to this deal. These guys are preparing a coup against you. Don't stop this. Go to the Security Council immediately. This is going to be a coup. And they didn't.
And instead, he should have been dealing with the leader of a nation who responds by sending troops in when people disagree
I would have
with him.
sent troops if I was advising him. When they started killing police, 20 police were killed by the so-called protesters. If
and
20 police
have been killed?
would have died in London, there would be a martial law here at once.
So could you just answer, do you know how many protesters were shot by the snipers?
Nobody knows because the snipers working for the opposition. They shot at both sides.
Of course people know.
Now we know.
We don't know that to be a fact, but
now we know.
Marta, of course, there hasn't been an inquiry so far that the Ukrainian government has not launched an inquiry. Let me just
But on that point, I just would like to say that there were British forensic experts working actually in Kiev and investigating the whole situation with
There was
snipers.
no inquiry. There was no independent
Absolutely,
inquiry.
they were.
We need to get to the bottom of it, because
there were pro-government supporters shot as well.
This
We can't have an
conversation-
independent inquiry.
There was a
International
policeman
observers are
whose
not
eyes
let
was
in by
gorged
Russian
and
troops.
a hand
We know
cut
that
off.
we
shouldn't
there was
deal in this.
violence,
Well,
and
exactly.
Because it's
we
not
need
yet
to
been
get to the bottom of
investigated,
it.
sorry.
We don't have the facts in front of us. Let's go back to our Twitter war. Bay says, what's the difference between Ukraine and the situation in the Gaza Strip? Gaza Strip, I think, in other words, look, geographically, as students of the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 21 will know, that basically if you take Crimea and sit there surrounded by another country, as Baron Wrangel did in 1920, things don't look so bright. And in other words, there's a tiny enclave, you've taken it, it's surrounded by a hostile power, it's finished. Crimea, it's finished under the current situation. It can't survive as an independent part of the Russian Federation, can it?
Well, it can survive. Why not? I mean, but first of all, by the way, if you remember the Civil War, my family was retreating as white officers through Crimea to Europe, and these hordes of communist thugs, killers, were attacking from the north. And by the way, the Bolsheviks were funded by the German intelligence. Now we have films about that. You must understand what was going on.
This is a different topic.
And what we're saying here is that the Crimea can survive, even without
Crimea.
Ukraine,
Okay, you think
no
it can?
problem.
So to that question, okay, right. Let's look at some more. Dominic Penner, will rhetoric concerning sanctions and retaliation end up doing more harm than good in terms of achieving a resolution? Let me turn to you, Kate Maltby, because I think really this is aimed at the Americans, because you can't exactly say that the Europeans have come up with much rhetoric about any kind of sanctions, but the Americans have, and the Americans keep saying things and don't do anything. And in the end, we've all grown up in a world, even the youngest people watching this, have grown up in a world where America seems to be able to take action decisively. We're seeing in America floundering. I mean, how does that look to you?
Well, only a child would claim that two wrongs make a right. So given the number of people who've been talking recently about the American invasion of Iraq, the American invasion of Afghanistan, I think it's very important to note that any erosion of America's recent moral authority is no grounds for us all to roll over and let another dictator invade in another part of the world. On the issue of sanctions, I think only America can really impose sanctions, because it's true that Europe is very dependent on gas from Russia. America is not in the same way. But what's most important is that these sanctions have to surprise Putin, because he hasn't expected America to do anything. It didn't do anything in South Ossetia. It didn't do much in Syria. We need to surprise him.
Right. We're going to go back. Brenda, comment. We're happy to allow the Scots to have a referendum to leave the UK, and we'll accept their decision. Why not let the Crimeans the same freedom without complaint? The point's been also made this week about Catalonia. To you, Marta, I mean, surely, country being formed, let's face it, if Ukraine comes out of this with its current setup, with its current government, it will be newly Western orientated, newly strong. The Crimeans didn't sign up for that, the Crimean Russians. Why not let them express their right to self-determination?
And I do agree with you. I think it's up to people of Ukraine decide how they want to see their country in the future. So, if the rules, regulations and law were developed for such referendum, I don't think people of Ukraine would mind that, Crimeans decide to have this referendum. But the reality is that at the moment we do not have legal rules and regulations around that. So any referendum being held in 2 weeks just won't be legal.
We're coming towards the end, but I want to try and bring you towards the future, because we've analysed it. The differences are civilly expressed, but not very reconcilable. What next? I mean, what would you, Kate Maltby, do next, and what do you expect next? I mean, you're here speaking to somebody who studies and intervenes in Western diplomacy at a certain level. What the for is going to happen in the next week or so?
I think it's much easier to predict what can and should happen in 6 months than in the next week. And in fact, I agree with Marta that if there is to be a referendum in Crimea, we need a lot more time. I mean, at the moment, they're pushing the referendum closer and closer and closer, basically so that they can fix it. The first thing that happens is that international observers have to be allowed in, which currently they're not being. Russian troops, well, I call them Russian troops, are going to have to start declaring physically. I mean, we're talking about people on the ground in Crimea with guns who are not wearing insignia. There are all these brigades going around who aren't identifying themselves. People have to be honest about who's on the ground.
Okay. And Alexander Nekrassov, that is an important issue for international law, isn't it? Those people have the responsibility to maintain rule of law and the security of anybody. You know, let's accept they're there for the duration. Crimea's gone. But those people on the ground in the balaclavas have to start anteing up on who they are.
No, they are Russian troops.
They're Russians. You accept that. It's not. It's a fiction. It's busted away. It's on record.
They're Russian troops. Nobody could understand one thing. He was sarcastic. He was saying, if you guys in Washington and London and Paris think that these thugs in Kyiv are freedom fighters, then there are those boys with the guns in Crimea are not Russian troops. Exactly. That was the message.
You would have sent troops in. What should happen next? What do you think Putin? Do you think Putin should back down at all, or should he just steam into East Ukraine?
I can tell you something. If the West continues this campaign, Ukraine will be split. The East will not accept a pro-Western government in Kyiv. The Western part, without the East, will collapse, because all the production is in the East. That's the power base. The West is just tourism and basically nothing else. So that's the point. I think we are going for a split, which is not a good idea, by the way.
Marta Mulyak, how does that, I mean, did people in the Euromaidan really think they would be looking at that possibility? And I think we have to accept that there is a possibility of that when they started. And what should they do? What should they do now? Is there any mood of, oh my goodness, we've overplayed our hand?
No, absolutely not. I think today Ukraine is more united than ever. And I am very proud of Ukrainian people. I'm very proud of Crimean people not being afraid anymore and not being afraid of Russia as well anymore. So today we see in Kharkiv, in Donetsk, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Luhansk, in Odessa, in Crimea, people singing Ukrainian national anthem. People want Ukraine to be united, one country. And that's not the question. The question is when Putin will take his troops out of Ukraine. And this is the only question that has to be answered, and it has to be as soon as possible.
Marta Mulyak, Alexander Nekrassov, Kate Maltby, we are out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obviously, this story is going to run and run. In the last few minutes, there have been reports that armed men have entered a Ukrainian military post in Crimea and taken control with no shots fired. We'll have all the latest online and on our next bulletin at 6:10 tomorrow on Channel 4. You can follow our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, on Twitter. She's in Ukraine. And thanks to my guests here, Kate Maltby, Alexander Nekrassov and Marta Mulyak, and to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to tweet us at #WT4. Good night.